Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to join us today. We have another great interview in the program Through the Arsenal Gates. I give everybody the opportunity to meet people who have made history, are making history, and will make history. Now, today, we have somebody from outside of Dearborn. Would you believe that? It's the first time in the history of this program that we've had somebody from outside of Dearborn. But my guest today, Frank Joyce, has such a great story that I said, we got to have him on the show. Everybody in Dearborn is going to rave about him. Frank, tell us, this is Frank Joyce. Frank, tell us where you grew up.
Hi, Glenn. Well, I'll give you the long version. As I am sometimes wont to do. My parents were early white flighters. And so when I was still an infant, although I was born in Detroit, they fled to the almost brand new city of Berkeley, Michigan. And that would have been in the late 1940s. And so through the third grade, I grew up in Berkeley, and then the family was expanding and needed a bigger home. So we moved from Berkeley to Royal Oak, and I stayed in Royal Oak through high school at Royal Oak Dondero High School, and then moved to an apartment near the Wayne State campus where I was going to school at the time.
When you were 12 years old, what did you think you wanted to do when you grew up?
One of my parents' best friends was an attorney, and so I was maybe a little bit intrigued by that. And my sister, who was 13 months younger than I, went on to become an attorney and a pioneering attorney, especially as a woman for that. When I was 12 years old, I had a paper route. And so I have this long association with newspapers and with print journalism, and a part of my life has been in journalism, print and radio and television. So maybe that planted some of those seeds back when I was 12.
Frank, tell our audience what your philosophy of life is.
My philosophy of life is to try to make the world a better place. And that is as rewarding a way to pursue life and its ups and downs and its many pleasures, I think. I guess the one thing I would say is very important is a lot of humor and laughing. Oh, and drink good wine.
Very good. And how about your values? What would you say your values are?
Very early in my life, basically as a teenager, I started becoming an anti-racist. And that has defined my life in many, many ways. And because racism is so essential to the United States, to its coming into existence in the first place, and to this day, I think that I'm entirely comfortable saying that one of my core values is be anti-racist.
Very good. Now, you've had, I suspect, a lot of minor jobs along the way before you pick your formal career in communications. What were some of the minor jobs that you've had?
My first job where I got a paycheck started when I was 14 years old, and it was a formative experience. I worked at Barkey Kazlerian's Royal Oak Cleaners on 11 Mile Road, not too far off of Woodward in Royal Oak. And Barkey was really a mentor to me, and I think to other young people. I'm still in touch with some of his children and members of his family. And I think from him, I learned a lot about, sort of traditional Protestant work ethic, work habits, and what it meant to be in the workforce. But I've had a lot of jobs. I've worked in factories. I've worked briefly at a car dealership in the parts department. I worked in a gas station for a while. I guess sort of the normal things.
Okay. You worked for WDET for a while. Tell us what you did there.
Sure. Well, prior to working to WDET, I actually got my start in radio journalism at WABX, the legendary rock and roll station in Detroit. I started there as a reporter, and then I became news director there. And then actually I went to TV. I went from WABX to WTVS. And at the time, WTVS had a local news program, and I worked on that program for several years. And then from WTVS, I think there was a brief period in there where I was an independent journalist, but then went to WDET and was the news director there, basically the early to mid 1980s.
Okay. And
I'm still a big fan of WDET. I'm still very involved with the station in various ways. And I think WDET is an enormous community asset to the Detroit area.
Tell us about your work with the UAW.
I went from WDET to become the assistant director of the communications department at the UAW, and then later became director. It's a dubious distinction, but a distinction nevertheless. I think to this day, I'm still the longest serving PR director at the UAW. I served as director for 12 years. It's a pretty hard job, and people don't necessarily last that long there. There's a sort of a burnout factor, and also a lot of internal politics goes on at the UAW that impacts who holds some of those positions. In any case, I was at the UAW from 1986. I retired from there in 2004. Those were, of course, tumultuous years for the UAW and for the auto industry and for Detroit. They've all been tumultuous, but there were particular challenges in those years as what we now refer to as the Legacy Three, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, were facing tremendous challenges initially from cars imported from Germany and Japan, and then that was followed by manufacturers locating in the United States, starting with Volkswagen and then Honda in Ohio, and on and on and on. As we know now, the vehicle manufacturing industry is fully globalized. Cars are still imported in large numbers to the United States, and virtually every major manufacturer has assembly plants and supplier plants in the U.S. As well. It's a very different industry. Let me put it this way, it was a very different industry when I left than it was even in the relatively short time when I began in 1986.
Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a tidbit here. I was at the Walter Reuther Library at Wayne State University doing some research for the Dearborn Historian. And I called for a book, and while I was waiting, I said, I'm going to take a look at the newspapers from Wayne State University going back to July and August of 1967. If you will recall, that was the time of the, quote, riots. And as I was looking through the papers, whose picture was on a very prominent page. I think it was either page 1 or 2 of one of the newspapers, but Frank Joyce. So he was active in the whole issue of racism at a very young age. Now, I always refer to that terrible time as the time of the riots, and Frank introduced me to a new term about a year ago, and that was the term insurrection. Frank, you want to talk about the terms?
Sure. That's a great topic, Glenn. For one thing, I want to talk about vocabulary in general, because the words that we use in a society that has been founded on the assumptions of white supremacy from even before our founding as a nation, there's a whole vocabulary that goes with that. And there are words that white people learn essentially, from birth onward, about how to understand the world and about how to operate in a society that has, from the beginning, had a gender, race, economic, and violence hierarchy. And that, of course, goes back to the origins of colonialism and to Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, discovering America. Let's talk about that for a second. So the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America is itself an important vocabulary concept to understand. What we now call America, of course, was a highly evolved set of civilizations in the northern and southern hemisphere that were already here. So the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered some virgin territory that we tend to think of as devoid of other Homo sapiens is itself a very important turning point in who we are as a society and how we think of ourselves today. And of course, we know now that there's a lot of pushback against the distortion of history represented by Columbus Day and so on and so forth. And that may seem like a distant topic, but it relates very directly to whether or not we call what happened in Detroit in late July of 1967 a riot, which of course is a derogatory term. It's a prerogative. Rioting is a bad thing, as distinct from an insurrection or a rebellion, because after all, we learned from an early age as young people that the United States was founded in rebellion against the oppressive power of the British monarchy and or of the East India Trading Company. So rebellions are good, apparently, unless they're done by people of color, in this case, particularly Black people. In which case we call them riots. And this issue of how 1967 is referred to resonates to this day. People still argue about, should it be called an insurrection? Should it be called a rebellion? Should it be called a riot? What should it be called? I published a piece on one of the anniversaries of an op-ed in the Free Press some years ago, in which I made the case for using the term insurrection or rebellion as opposed to riot, because those terms are associated with legitimate and appropriate opposition to an existing oppressive hierarchy. And of course, we live to this day in a racial hierarchy that entitles and advantages white people to the disadvantage of people of color, be they indigenous, be they Asian, be they Black, be they Latin, or whatever. So I guess the way I sum this up is words matter.
Okay. Frank, what were you doing during the insurrection?
Well, as it happens, I was in London, England, when the rebellion broke out, and I was attending something called the Dialectics of Liberation Conference. And the Dialectics of Liberation Conference in London, England, had been called by a sort of coalition, if you will, of political activists, primarily European, but not exclusively. And one of the people they invited to be a speaker was then known as Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture. And Stokely invited me to come to the conference, and then during his remarks at the conference, invited me to come to the stage and talk about the concept of doing anti-racist work in white communities as the focus of what white people supporting the movement should be doing. And I was already doing that at the time. By 1967, I had helped to found an organization called People Against Racism. And at that point, I think People Against Racism probably had about 25 chapters in communities, some on college campuses, some not, throughout the United States. And was, I genuinely believe, a pioneering organization doing anti-racist work primarily within white communities. So when word of what was happening in Detroit reached me, I immediately left the conference, and it took a while to rearrange my travel plans, but my instinct was to immediately return to Detroit, which is what I did.
How might you say that the Vietnamese War, or is it as it was called in Vietnam, the American War, how could you say that it was a racist war?
One of the first debates we had within People Against Racism, this would have probably been either in late 1965 or maybe in 1966, was what posture, what stance were we going to take as an organization about the war? Because by that time, there was already emerging substantial opposition to that war within the United States. The first anti-war teach-in was held, I believe, in March of 1965 at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. We reached the conclusion that the war was racist and therefore well within the purview of what People Against Racism was all about, for two reasons. One, it was resulting in disproportionate casualties, particularly for Black soldiers, but soldiers of color in general. More Black people were getting killed in Vietnam and getting injured in Vietnam in proportion to their numbers in the population than was the case for white people. That was true of the Korean War as well. It's been true of many wars in U.S. history. The other reason we concluded that it was a racist war is because it was a war being committed on people of color. In the current environment, I'm involved in a conversation about, are we in danger, or for that matter, already involved in World War III? My position is that we are already involved in a world war, as represented by what's going on in Ukraine, but it's not World War III, it's World War IV. And the reason I say that is that what World War III is what's called the Cold War. And the reason, ironically, that it's called the Cold War is because white people kind of define the terminology, as I said earlier. And so white people say that the period following World War II, which evolved into primarily a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union and China and Vietnam and Korea, is called a Cold War because to get the title World War, it has to be white people fighting other white people. Let me try to make that a little bit clearer. If somebody was in Vietnam from the years 1963 until 1975, there was nothing cold about that war whatsoever. More bomb tonnage was dropped on Vietnam during the American War on Vietnam than in all other wars previously. That's not a Cold War, that's a hot war. The war when the United States invaded Korea, that wasn't a Cold War, that was a hot war. So my argument is that what we call the Cold War was World War III. And what is going on with the proxy war in Ukraine with Russia versus the United States and various NATO European countries is the beginning of World War IV. And we're in a far more dangerous situation, including the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons, than I think we generally acknowledge. So
you were involved in an activity that it just knocks my socks off, and that is that you were on a peace-making mission to Vietnam. Tell our
yes.
audience about that.
Sure. One of the things that is quite unusual about the U.S. war on Vietnam and then ultimately Laos and Cambodia as well is the extent and degree of opposition that it gendered within the United States itself. Mostly, we're a warrior nation. We were founded in a violent struggle with the British. Prior even to the founding of the nation, we were involved in the violent attacks on the indigenous people and in the violence that's required to have a slave trade, a foreign slave trade and a domestic slave trade. So the United States has always worshipped violence, and the United States has always been a very violent and militaristic society. So the idea that there would be any opposition to any war at all is, pardon the expression, kind of un-American. It's contrary to the evolution of how we have come to exist as a country. One way I express that sometimes, and for years I've said this, the reason the United States was in Vietnam is the same reason that the United States was in Ohio, and then in California, and then in the Philippines, and then in Hawaii. We have had this violent expansionist tendency. It's how Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote a very important book called An Indigenous People's History of the United States, invites us to think about, well, how did we get from the Atlantic to the Pacific? We were founded as 13 colonies, but we didn't stay 13 colonies very long, because those 13 colonies then expanded, as we know, as they say, to Ohio, then to the Pacific Ocean, and then beyond. So that's who we are. So the idea that during a war in which the United States was occupying a faraway foreign land, that people from the United States would go to that foreign land and try to understand what was happening from the point of view of those who we were invading was a pretty radical idea. And that process started in 1965. Three people, Herbert Aptheker, Stoughton Lind, and Tom Hayden, made the first visit of representatives of the peace movement in the United States to Hanoi. And subsequently, there were several delegations from 1965 through 1975 of people who made that trip. And I was one of those people in May of 1970. One of the stories that was deeply moving to me then, and that I still tell, is that I was in a small village pretty far from Hanoi towards the south on May 4th, 1970. And that's the date that 4 students were killed demonstrating against the war at Kent State University in Ohio. And we were informed that killing had taken place by our Vietnamese hosts. And I've told this story several times, but it became very clear to me in that moment that something had profoundly shifted about the war. And to this day, I still think that May 4th, 1970 was a turning point in galvanizing opposition to the war. Now, of course, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. We're very close to the anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January of 1973, which started the process of U.S. withdrawal, and the war itself didn't actually end until 1975. But the idea of people's diplomacy, of ordinary citizens such as myself, engaging with a nation state that we were at war with is, I think, still a very powerful idea.
Absolutely. Frank, we're running out of time, unfortunately. Tell us about your return back to Vietnam in 2013. Give us a brief overview.
Sure. So in 2013, I made my 3rd trip to Vietnam. And the reason for that was to celebrate the anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, in which the People's Peace Treaty and people's diplomacy had played a significant role in bringing that about. So we participated in observances of the 40th anniversary in 2013 of that event. This year, the 50th anniversary is being observed. And out of that, I, with a colleague, became the co-editor of a book called The People Make the Peace, Lessons from the Vietnam Anti-War Movement. And that was based on that trip and a delegation of 9 of us who had previously been to Vietnam during the war, telling our stories of our time in Vietnam then and what the impact of that was on us.
Where outside of the United States might one find this book?
Well, one of the things I'm very proud of, actually, is that the book was translated into Vietnamese and published in Vietnam, and the book is on library shelves and in bookstores.
Is it found in schools and in libraries in Vietnam?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Because, of course, the Vietnamese every society has the same problem, which is that they think these kids have no idea what we went through, us old people. And so the Vietnamese want young Vietnamese people to understand the war and the U.S. anti-war movement as well.
Frank, we're wrapping it up right now. Tell us what you want people to say about you when you've gone to the next life.
Oh, I want people to say that, to use a phrase that's associated with a lot of other people, I guess he fought the good fight. I use the word fight advisedly, though, because maybe what I'd like more than anything is to be known as a peacemaker.
Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this program with Frank Joyce, a real activist. If you enjoyed the program, tell all your friends and relatives. If you didn't enjoy it, which is hard to believe, don't tell anybody. Just keep it to yourself. Thanks for joining us.